If there's a fire tower available, my tip is to climb it. Gosh, what a spectacular view.
Oh,
any time of year, but boy, in the fall, if you can hike an Indiana fire tower, that's a great day.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the fire towers. Climbing them, you really do get such a beautiful view of the park. When we did Obachi, I took my 11-year-old with me, and she was very scared to go up. But once we got to the top, she said, I'm so glad I did this. Can you imagine, what I would have missed if I didn't come up here just because I was scared? And I thought, what a good metaphor.
Welcome to In the Parks, an Indiana State Parks podcast. I'm Allison Martin, and I'm excited to tell the stories of these amazing places in the Hoosier State. Our parks show off the best of Indiana, and it's time to go in-depth to really know the stories and discover what makes each destination unique and valuable as part of Indiana. On In the Parks, you'll learn about the people, legends, and places that formed Indiana's parks in the past and who is writing the story now. Today we're going up to the top of fire towers. We're going to learn how they worked, what lookouts did, and also about fire lookouts, specifically some of the women who helped fight major fires in Indiana by manning the fire towers. So let's get ready to climb. Fire towers are one of those state park features that are consistently a favorite. These soaring structures are easy to spot, can be nerve-wracking to climb, but provide incredible views from the top. You may have already climbed a fire tower at one of these state parks: McCormick's Creek, Obannon Woods, Tippecanoe River, Obachi, Lincoln, or Brown County. It was the climb up McCormick's Creek's fire tower that got me interested in the history of them, not just the amazing views from the top. On the ground, I spotted an informational sign. It read, "Many Indiana lookouts were local farmers recruited when the fire danger was high. Sometimes a wife or other family member would serve as a lookout. During World War II, many of Indiana's lookouts were women." And the sign also featured a picture of a woman named Leah Daughters at Buck Rock Lookout in Sequoia National Forest in California. I learned Leah Daughters started the job at 18 years old, and she remained active as a director and advisor for over 70 years. So then I became super curious. Who were the female fire lookouts in Indiana? And are there any still around today? And thankfully, the answer to both of these questions is yes. I'm excited to introduce you to one of them, Tina Ligman.
They also said that in the early days when they first started putting up towers, it cost twice as much if you got a tower that had steps, because the steps to ship all the materials to make those steps that go back and forth to the top cost a lot more than if you just got a ladder up the side, which to me would be terrifying. I was so glad my tower had steps because it is pretty daunting. Sometimes you have to go up in the dark, you have to go up when it's raining. If there's lightning storms, they want to know if there's any lightning fires that have gotten started.
If you listened to the Spring Mill State Park episodes, you might remember that we met Tina Ligman, who works with their Friends Volunteer Group. And I promised she'd be back because Tina is a fire tower expert and is such a fascinating person. She served in the military for 24 years, was a fire lookout, and worked in several national forests. I could have talked to her all day. So let's hear about her time in the tower.
My name is Tina Ligman, and I worked for 42 years with the Forest Service, and so I have a lot of experience with lookout towers, which is when I was invited to talk about lookout towers. I was so excited, and I've worked with DNR a lot with fires and things with the Forest Service. But my very first job was actually in a lookout tower, so I'm historical myself. It's kind of an antique. But back in the 70s, my very first job, I was hired with the U.S. Forest Service, and it happened to be a bad fire season. So my workstation was the Eastwood Lookout Tower on the Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri. So I would report in the morning if it was a high fire danger day to the top of this lookout tower, and I would spend my day looking for fires. At that time in the Ozarks, we had a lot of arson fires, and so for me, it was a chance to work in a lookout tower and work with the other lookouts and the fire community, and I really loved it. And so I learned a lot about lookout towers there, and it just really got me started with interest in lookout towers. So I did that for a few years there, but as you said, lookout towers kind of moved past. So then when I moved to Indiana, I happened to be at a forestry conference because I am a graduate in forestry, and I met Keith Argo, who was he's a National Forest Fire Lookout Association president. He was at that time, and so we were talking about our common interest in lookouts, and he said, "Well, Tina, we don't have a chapter chair for Indiana." He said, "I would love for you to take that job," and and I don't do well at saying no. So next thing I know, and for over 20 years now, I've been the chapter chair for the Indiana Forest Fire Lookout Association.
Tina is clearly an expert on fire towers and the lookout life. She gave me a brief overview of the history of fire towers in the United States.
This big urge to put up fire towers all around in the States and around, especially out west, started in 1910 when we had the big burns of 1910. And that year they lost over 3 million acres of virgin timber. I mean, that was when the West was uncut. And so that really terrified people. I mean, whole towns were burned over. A lot of people died. The Forest Service and the states realized fire is something we really need to be afraid of. And so they put up, in the next 20 years, they put up over 5,000 lookout towers. The peak of how many fire towers there were was about 8,000 nationally.
There are still about 2,500 fire towers across the country today, some still in use. When towers first started going up, they weren't always what we see today.
And so I got to looking, and the earliest tower I can find in Indiana was in 1914. It was down in Clark County near Henryville, and it said that it was a wooden tower, and it was 25 foot tall, and it had a sign on it that said, "Stay off, unsafe to climb." And so that was our very first tower. But I suspect, based on, because I know a lot of history about Missouri too, and there were a lot of wooden towers in the beginning, which not like the big tall metal towers you see today, because it was hard to get a wooden tower that tall. But they started out with these wooden towers, or they had just ladders that went up a tree. And I suspect there were more than we think, because in Jackson, Washington State Forest, I've hiked there a lot, and there's a place called Lookout Tower Point, and you know, you get up there and there's no way they could have had a big metal tower there, because there's none of the big footer or no metal in the ground. So I think it was probably just either a little wooden tower or a ladder up a tree.
Indiana started more thoroughly putting up fire towers in 1930. In the 50s, there were more than 30 across the state, some on public and some on private land.
At one time, Indiana had 33 lookout towers. And so at the time, though, I think this is kind of amusing, most of the states had already done some elevation mapping, so they knew where the higher points and the lower points were. But Indiana had not really gotten around to that in 1930, because most of Indiana is pretty flat,
right,
as you know, so it wasn't a priority for Indiana. So they put up 20 lookout towers, and they had 3 that had to be totally dismantled and moved because they were totally in the wrong place. 20 of them had to be extended and be taller, and then 11 more towers were needed to be able to be useful at all. So it was kind of hit and miss what Indiana did, but they got the job done. So in the end, they had 33 lookout towers, 3 in the north, the rest of them in the south, and 14 of those remain today. So they're not all safe to climb, but there are 14 still around.
The fire towers at state parks and in state forests are not used to spot fires anymore, so they're typically open to climb. However, there may be days or times they are closed for safety reasons. So if your heart is set on climbing one, call ahead to make sure it's open. Before we get into specific Indiana fire towers, it may be helpful to understand more of what lookouts did all day. And I shouldn't speak in the past tense, because there are still fire lookouts around the country, and they're actively doing the work, especially during fire season. As Tina said, lookouts regularly scan the area around the tower, identifying any possible fires, which means they need to be extremely knowledgeable of the area. But there's a lot more science to it. Along with their eyes, lookouts use a tool called an alidade for mapping smoke. It's a large round map with a compass that can be used to determine where the fire started and which way it's heading. Tina introduced me to a new term as well, azimuth, which is the angle on a compass expressed by degrees, like 90 degrees or 260 degrees. Lookouts also use a psychrometer, which is a wet and dry bulb thermometer that measures moisture in the air. Tools like these help identify conditions for a fire, as well as their location. Tina explains how all those tools were used together.
So you have to take the weather fairly regularly, and the weather, you don't take it at the top because fires don't happen 100 foot off the ground. So you go down to the bottom and you take the humidity, you have a sling psychrometer, you take the temperature, and you constantly are calling it in. So at my tower, I just had a radio. Some towers have telephones, so you have to report it. You have a log that you keep, a log to say, you know, what the weather is every hour, if that's how they might want it every 30 minutes, depending on the fire danger. And then you have a log that you report everything you see. So, like in my case, I wasn't constantly looking, because you're not as observant if you're looking constantly. So I had my binoculars and I had a book, and so I would look really carefully all around, and then I would read a page in my book, and then I would look again and read a page in my book. The little room is 7 by 7 in these normal towers that you see in Indiana, and it has a trap door, so you put the trap door down and then you can use the whole room, otherwise you fall through the trap door. So once you see something that looks suspicious, then you can take a reading on it. In the middle of the room there's a podium that has a big map on it with a circular It's called an Alidade or an Osborne firefinder. And so you line it up with the sighting thing, and then there's crosshairs, and you line it up with the smoke or the fire that you're seeing. And so you read the azimuths, and then you can actually tell the elevation with it. And so you write it down the first time, and you watch it for a while, because usually it's really small, and you make sure it's not just somebody burning trash or leaves in their backyard. And so if you're pretty sure, then, okay, yes, this is a smoke that needs to be reported, then you call it in. And so if I hear someone else call it in a neighboring tower, because there were 2 or 3 other towers when I was working in Missouri, so then I would swing my Alidade around and see if I could see what that guy was reporting, and then I would call it in, yes, I see it too, and here's the azimuth that I see it on. And then the dispatcher could run the 2 azimuths and see where they intersect, and then that's where the fire would be, and he would call somebody to go check it out.
Tina's familiarity with the terrain, locals, and smoke was so good she could tell the difference between types of fires and generally knew who was burning what.
Do the different smokes of different fires, can you tell a difference between them, or does it kind of, like, the longer you do it, or is it really still just like smoke is smoke? It's hard to tell.
Yeah, so white smoke is more what you see in the woods. Wood smoke is more white, and if it's a house fire, it's really black, and tires are different, So yeah, you can tell some difference in the... After a while, I could figure out, oh, that's just a sawmill fire, that's just a charcoal kiln. Or I would know so-and-so's always burning their fields.
Yeah.
I'd say, Joe Smith's just burning his field today, so don't worry about that smoke. So I would report those too, and I would call them in, I would put them in my log. And so all that stuff you're recording, as well as just watching the birds and the deer and whatever.
While that side of the lookout life sounds pretty idyllic, Tina mentioned that lookouts are also responsible for checking the area during lightning storms to see if fires have started. And she's been up in a tower during bad storms, which sounds really terrifying.
You would think those towers would be not very safe because they're so tall, but I've been up there in pretty high winds in my tower, and they were like trees. They really give with the wind. And so I thought, this is pretty scary before, but they tell you if it's lightning, one of the things that's in there is it's a wooden platform, and it has insulators on it, like those glass insulators you see on power lines where the lines are. And they said, just stand on that, Tina, don't touch anything, just stand on that little wooden platform when the lightning's all around you, and you'll be totally safe. And I've always trusted my government. I'd been in a lightning storm, and I just stood on my little wooden platform, and all was well. And I've never heard of anybody being struck by lightning in a storm. I think they are pretty safe. Those footers are so solid, and they're really bolted down. When they're first put together, they're really built well.
That made me feel a little better about climbing them in the parks. So what happened to fire towers? Why were they crucially important in the past, but not as much since?
I did a lot of towers for probably 2 years, and that was in the 70s, and so that was kind of the end of the tower time, because already people were getting more rural. People got telephones. Because believe it or not, right now we're saying a lot of people don't have internet access in rural communities. Well, back then a lot of people didn't have telephones in rural communities, in the Ozarks and in southern Indiana even, and so people were getting more telephones, and so then if there was a fire, they could call them in. But back in the day, a lot of people didn't have telephones, and so I know when the towers were first built, the towermen would say that so-and-so came up and asked if they could use my telephone. So they would climb the tower to see if they could call and say, my wife's having a baby or whatever. So things like that.
So they were used for more than just the fires at some point.
Right, because they were the only telephones in the communities. Everybody then pretty much had rural telephones, and then more people were flying around. Civil Air Patrol was doing in fire danger, and so that was kind of a free thing. They thought it was fun, and so they started reporting fires. And so in the 70s, it just kind of became, we weren't needed as much, and so they didn't send us up, and then they became obsolete.
After several years as a lookout, Tina eventually moved into another position within forestry and ended up in Indiana.
So I was a forester in southern Missouri, and I worked out in the field pretty much all the time. And I had a 2-year-old, I was a single mother with a 2-year-old child, and she broke her leg one day, and they wouldn't treat her because I couldn't be reached, because we didn't always have good radios, and you couldn't always have reception. And it just really made me realize I need a job where I'm more reachable. And so there was a public affairs job here, and I had a minor in journalism, so I came to Hoosier, and I was a public affairs officer for the Wayne in Ohio and the Hoosier in Indiana. So then that worked out better. I still did some forestry, because it was Forest Service, right. So I could keep my fingers in both. So I was just really happy here, and I spent 10 years on the Mark Twain, and then I've been on the Wayne and Hoosier in Indiana.
As the Indiana chapter chair of the Forest Fire Lookout Association, Tina has a scoop on all the best fire towers to climb. Here are some of her favorite spots in Indiana. The first is in Clark State Forest, not far from Charlestown and Falls of the Ohio State Parks, down near Louisville. The second is at O'Bannon Woods State Park.
So there are many towers around, some of the more interesting ones. Henryville, like I said, that was the earliest one, but that wooden one was replaced in 1928 with a 94-foot tower. And that one, I took my granddaughter. She goes around and inspects towers with me. She thinks it's pretty fun. But that one, she says, "Oma, you better not look. You better cover your eyes when you climb this tower. There's a lot of bad words and bad pictures on this tower." It was covered with graffiti and locks. And so it had padlocks all over it. I think we counted 42 locks maybe up and down that tower, which I'm told is significant if lovers go there or something. But
I think they do that a lot in different European bridges.
Yes.
But I've not seen that on any of the fire
it's
towers.
all over that Henryville tower, which is a pretty
romantic
tower.
spot.
It's really, it's a really unique little spot. But yeah, it's covered with colorful graffiti and padlocks. So I thought that was
and colorful language too, apparently.
So if you have sensitive nature, don't look. So, yeah, and the one at Wyandotte is specifically wobbly. That's when she would not climb with me. She got up about 2 ranks and she says, "Oh my, this tower's too scary. I'm going down." And that one had a sign that said it was built in 1932 and it burned in 1941 and they had to be rebuilt. So I'm wondering if that one didn't start out to be wooden as well and burn down.
A few other state parks with fire towers are Brown County and McCormick's Creek, which are great reminders of how much trees can grow in 100 years.
And the Brown County has that weed patch tower, which, again, a lot of these were so short, like the McCormick's Creek. When I first started going there, you couldn't even see over the trees. You know, you were just looking at the tree level, and I thought, and I even should have known better. I thought, well, why wasn't this one taller? But when they were built, they were all just built in flat fields with no trees. And so the weed patch one was built. A tornado had gone through. There was nothing but weeds, so they built it in a weed patch. McCormick's Creek, there's pictures of it being built, and there's nothing. It's just flat farmland with no trees. And so as the trees came up, then again, they just aren't tall enough.
Then you have towers like the one at Lincoln State Park, which are extra tall, probably to see over the trees they anticipated would grow. And it takes a little extra nerve to climb this one.
So Lincoln City, if you've been to that one, that's down Lincoln State Park. It's 120 foot, and
that's taller than the other ones.
It's taller, and you realize it's taller. I mean, I've climbed a lot of towers, and I'm thinking, boy, this is a long ways up. And when you're up there, you think, wow, it's tall. So even that difference of 10 feet or 20 feet from normal towers, really, you feel it, you know? So it is cool that it's so tall.
Was there a reason it needed to be taller, or they just
probably
happened to be?
Yeah,
okay,
because like I said, they had to raise some of those other towers because they couldn't see over the other hills.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're trying to, it beats having to build a couple more towers. So if you can just lift it up a little more so you can see over the hills is helpful.
While many towers are on state land, there are some on private property. So if your goal is to climb them all, please be aware that may not be possible. And towers on private land may not be in as good of shape, so climbing them is not always advised. Thankfully, Tina has total confidence in climbing the open towers in state and national parks or forests. Many of the old ones have been restored or completely redone, whether through Friends Group fundraisers like at Obachi and McCormick's Creek, or from government funding like the ARRA, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Because of that act, Morgan Monroe State Forest was able to completely redo their Mason Ridge Tower, and Tina got to see all the major steps along the way, even figuring out how the tower pieces were originally delivered.
They actually took the whole thing down. They took it all apart with a big crane, and they sandblasted it, and they did the whole thing and then put it back up. And one of the things they saw on the struts was the different struts had the address of a local farmer. So then they shipped it nearby, so then they could come and put the whole
that's kind of fun
thing together. Yeah,
that's fun.
So that was interesting information.
Now, the old towers have been inspected and restored, so they're safe to climb. But how were they put up originally when the parts were moved from the farmer's house to the park? Well, I for one am thankful for safety conditions and inspections today. Wait till you hear who assembled the fire tower that once stood at Cataract Falls. Tina said if you find the right place in the woods, you can see some of the remains.
This tower is not here anymore, but the Cataract Tower at Cataract Falls, is that a state recreation area, state park?
I didn't know that they used to have a fire tower there.
There used to be a tower there, so I just happened to interview this man. Someone told me about him. They said, he knows a lot about the old Cataract Tower. You should go talk to him. He's a really interesting guy. And I said, okay. So I drove up there. He was great. So his name was Don Meeks, and he said he and 3 other high school boys were hired by the DNR to dig footers. And he said he was 17 at the time, and they told him they'd pay him 50 cents an hour to dig a footer. And he said, how hard could that be? I thought that'd be great money.
No.
But it had to be 7 foot by 7 foot by 8 foot.
That's a lot of work.
And up by Indianapolis, that might not be so hard, but in southern Indiana with all our rocks, he said that was a hard job.
Between the clay soil and the rocks,
yes,
that would take us so long.
It took 3 days. He said he made $24.
Yes, 4 17-year-old boys were responsible for establishing the foundation of a 100-foot tall fire tower. But hold on, it gets even better. Or maybe worse?
So they dug these, and he kept saying, are you sure a smaller hole won't work? And they said, no, they have to be, and they are regulation. That's how they, because he says they have to be that big so the towers won't blow over. And then he said his older brother, Wayne, and this other guy, they got the contract to put the tower up. And he said they didn't know anything about putting up towers. Anyway, they put the tower up. He said they didn't have any safety equipment. They were just climbing all over. You know, they started at the bottom, they read the instructions, and they put the whole tower up. And then his brother Wayne got the job as being the towerman, and he had the tower for 6 years. But he said he was so proud of himself. He said it was a 100-foot tower, and he said he could come down and visit with his friends, and if the phone at the top rang, he could get up there and answer it before the third ring. That really impressed me. Do you know how, have you climbed a 100-foot tower?
That's really impressive.
I know. I just think some of these old tower stories are just pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So that's your next challenge. Make it to the top of a fire tower in the time it takes the phone to ring 3 times. Tina also said it was pretty normal for regular citizens to man the fire towers as lookouts. That was part of the intention behind creating them, to develop community fire responsibility.
When they put up the Willow Valley Tower at Martin State Forest, Richard Lieber, who is the father of state parks, came and gave a little speech. And I thought it was interesting in his speech. He said, the state will provide the tower and they will pay for the observer. But he says it's up to the residents to organize, provide tools, and join in the firefighting. So it kind of goes back to the Smokey Bear message. You know, only you all have the job to help protect your forests from fire. So I really liked that message. So for a long time, it wasn't the DNR and the Forest Service coming to put out the fires. It was a local community effort. So we had fire wardens, and the fire wardens were pretty much volunteers. Actually, I read somewhere they had to be of high character, they had to have a vehicle and a telephone. So
Perfect.
Those were the qualifications. But they were mostly men that had good relationships in their community. So there was a little sign, and when I moved here in the 80s, there were still several around, because I remember seeing the little fire warden signs, and then they were little red, they kind of looked like little outhouses, but they were right out by the road. They were red metal, had a roof, and then they had either a DNR or a Forest Service symbol on the front. And they had enough tools in them for 10 firefighters. And so it was the fire warden's job to keep the tools sharp, keep them clean, and make sure they were all in good working order. And so he had to have enough of his neighbors that if he was called and said, there's a fire down on Simpson Creek, you know, such and such a place, that he would call around and try to get his neighbors to round them up and load them up in the back of his pickup or whatever and go put out the fire. He would also teach the high school boys how to use his tools. And we've got pictures of him working with high school boys to teach them how to do it.
Some of my listeners may remember seeing those red fire warden sheds. So if you have any pictures or stories, I'd love to hear them. As Tina mentioned, high school boys were involved in building towers and were trained to fight fires. Men were fire wardens throughout the state. But the sign at McCormick's Creek that got me really intrigued by fire towers showed a woman doing the job. And I know there are plenty of stories about men who spotted fires as lookouts, used their skills and relationships as fire wardens to activate a community and stop fires. The Dutch Ridge Fire near Bartlettsville in 1952 is the largest recorded fire in Indiana, with over 4,000 acres of land burning. 300 people, likely all men, helped fight that fire, even driving teenage boys from high school over on a school bus to help. But look, I'm a girl, so when I discovered stories of women as fire lookouts, I had to dig in because they're different and interesting. These were women doing something that would have shocked many who believed women weren't physically, mentally, or emotionally strong enough to handle hard things. There's even a difference between the expectations Tina's mother felt on her and what Tina was able to do for her own job.
You know, my mother, when she was growing up, she was born in 1931 or 2. Anyway, she said, I only wanted to be a conservation officer. And she could mimic any bird. She could call birds in. She knew all her stars. She was so good at it, loved nature. And so she said, I kept telling people I wanted to be a conservation officer. And they said, Carol, you can't be a conservation. You can be a teacher or a nurse or a secretary. Girls can't be conservation. And she said, I just kept telling them, but that's what I want to be. And so So she ended up being a home ec teacher. And she didn't enjoy cooking. She was wonderful at all those things. But any chance she got with us, she took us outside. She taught us all those things. So I became a forester, and she was so proud of me. I hate to cook. I hate to sew. I know how to do those things. But I think from her, I learned those aren't fun things. This is what's fun. And so she passed all that on to me.
For many women, meeting societal expectations was necessary and helpful, even safe. But even in the early 1900s, there were outliers and women who were working as fire lookouts out of necessity, like Mabel Gray.
The very first documented female fire lookout was in 1902. And so this was out west, and one of the timber companies was worried about the extreme fire danger in Idaho. And so the owner asked his camp cook. He said, there's a hill up there, and he said, on it there's this old wolf tree. And he says, I put a ladder against it. So he says, after you get done with your morning cooking for the crew in the morning and do the dishes, he says, could you ride a horse up there, climb up that ladder? He says, there's an old limb, and he says, take a shotgun, and there's a limb there, and he says, if you see any smoke, fire the shotgun, and then hurry back and tell us what direction to ride in, and we'll go put out the fire. So she did it until the fire danger was over, and I think she spotted some fires, and they went and put out the fire. So Mabel was the first official fire lookout that we know of. And at that point where that old wolf tree is, there's still a fire lookout. It's the 6th fire lookout that has replaced that old wolf tree.
Mabel's not the only woman who took on the job. Hallie Morse Daggett was the first female lookout hired by the Forest Service. Born in 1878, Hallie had been afraid of wildfires since she was a little girl, but she also grew up hiking in and loving the Siskiyou Mountains of California. Her father owned Black Bear Mine and later served as California's lieutenant governor. He was also the superintendent of the San Francisco Mint. After attending boarding school in San Francisco, Hallie started applying for jobs at the U.S. Forest Service, but not for a clerical position. She wanted to fight fires. She loved the forest and wanted to protect them. I wonder what her clearly wealthy family thought about that. She wasn't waiting around for the next eligible suitor. She wanted to make an impact in a different way. It wasn't until there was an opening at the Eddy Gulch Lookout Station that Hallie finally got her break. She wrote yet another letter applying for the job and beat out 2 other men who applied. The ranger who received her application wrote a letter to his boss recommending her. He said, "I hope your heart is strong enough to stand the shock. It's this. One of the most untiring and enthusiastic applicants which I have for the position is Miss Hallie Morse Daggett." Hiring a woman over 2 men? Shocking in 1913. But Hallie was truly the most qualified because of her extreme knowledge of the mountains and rivers in the area. It's what set her apart from the other applicants.
And she was hired in 1913 for the Forest Service, and she worked on the Klamath National Forest, and I fought fire with the Forest Service too, and I fought fire on the Klamath, and it's a really rugged national forest. And so she's one that would have gone up and stayed pretty much for the whole season. Although they said they gave her 2 days off a month, so she might have been able to come back then.
Generous.
But she said she packed a pistol. She had to cut all of her own firewood, haul all of her own water, and so she lasted for 15 seasons or so, I think. But she was 35 when she started doing it, and she was just quite the hero.
One report was that many other Forest Servicemen thought she would be too scared and lonely and would want to quit. But they described her as, quote, full of pluck and high spirit, and said she grew more and more in love with the work. Whether she was cut off when the phone lines went down, had to melt snow for water, or had to shoot a bear, Hallie remained undaunted. She spotted 40 fires in her first season, and only 5 acres of land burned. She retired from her work in 1927 at around 50 years old. But Hallie remained a rarity for a while.
But not many women followed her until World War II. And then in World War II, when so many men went off to war, they really needed women. And so they had women driving logging trucks, working in sawmills, and working in lookout towers. And so that kind of opened the door. And then in the 60s, the rules changed, and lookout tower people had to not only find the fires, but then if they saw one, because it was this, they thought if they got to fires right away and put them out, that was the best policy. So then the women were expected to spot a fire and then rush down and put the fire out and then hurry back and look for the next one. And so they didn't think women were capable of doing that.
Right, that's
in the 60s.
so much to ask for a woman to do.
And so the only exception to that was if you could get a couple, a husband and wife, to do it. And so that was acceptable because then the husband could rush off and the woman could watch for the next fire and then direct him to that, or if it was too much, then she could call in additional help. And actually my aunt and uncle did that. So they worked in Arizona. And again, that's part of the reason I also liked fires, because my Aunt Mary Alice would tell me about her and Ed. They did the Rincon Mountains in Arizona.
In Indiana, there was another couple who worked together to fight fires, but not quite by following the expected procedures. The reason Clarissy Carroll ended up reaching new heights was because her husband was not interested in being a fire lookout. He was a fire warden, so he was expected to take the position, but it didn't last long.
She was actually not hired for the job. Her husband was hired to do the job, but he got bored. It didn't take him long to think of all the other things he'd rather do than stand up in that lookout tower. So he said, Clarissy, why don't you take over? And she loved it. She wrote poetry, she watched the animals, and she said there's no job she would rather have done than that lookout tower job. And she was very good at it. So the DNR that hired her said, or hired her husband said, you just keep doing it, Clarissy, you're great.
Clarissy later said, that was it. The rules were not as strict then as now. I didn't notify anyone I was taking over the job of tower man. I just did. That spirit of stepping in, and in this case stepping up 100 or so stairs to the top of the tower, is what defined Clarissy and many other women. She saw a job, was interested, did it, liked it, and continued doing it well, without always asking for official permission. Clarissy ended up being the lookout in the Georgia Tower in Mitchell, Indiana for 20 years. Her sister Nellie was the lookout in another fire tower, and her husband Clinton was the county fire warden. He and Clarissy worked together fighting Indiana's second largest blaze, the Georgia Fire. It began at 2:18 p.m. on November 10th, 1964.
So Lookout Tower was a Georgia lookout, and it was manned by a woman. So Clarissy Carroll was working the lookout tower when she first saw it was an arson fire. So she saw several smokes along the road. So she called it in. She said, someone's setting arson fires today. And so they sent somebody to start working on them, but then she saw the fire spreading. It had been a really dry, high fire danger.
Clarissy called Carpenter's Body Works, a local factory that made buses, and asked for volunteers to fight the fire. Between the men on the assembly line and others in the community that her husband had rounded up, they had an army ready to go.
700 people came out to fight that fire. That's how big it was. And so the fire wardens rounded up a lot of those people. They went and got high school boys. And again, they just pulled up at the high school. Any boy that wanted to fight fire jumped in the back of pickup trucks and they went and fought fire. I was given a program once, and Susan Crawford, she's from here in Mitchell, and she said, well, it wasn't just the boys. We came too. We set up refreshment stands for all the firefighters. And so it was a community effort. So They all worked to help put the fire out.
Unfortunately, part of the fire was on private property, and the owner wouldn't let people on his land. By the next day, the fire had spread further, so the nearby naval base had to get involved.
I think it took 3 days, and they had Crane came and brought dozers, the Crane Naval Weapons Depot, which is just west of here. It was a big deal. They lost some houses, but nobody was killed. It just kept spreading because it was so dry.
Every time it seemed like the fire was almost controlled, something would go wrong. The dozers were stopped by the terrain, or the humidity dropped, or the wind shifted. It seemed like the fire was winning, and even Clarissy, in her lookout tower, was in danger.
Actually, she was in the tower, and she was calling out, where the fire was spreading, because she had a bird's eye view up there. And Paul Sanders, the conservation agent, came, and he said, Clarissy, your steps are on fire. Get down out of that tower now. And she said, I did feel like a smoked herring.
So she was in the tower, and the fire is coming in while she's in the tower.
Yes, so she got out of it, and he hosed down the tower. So he saved the tower for her while she evacuated. Yeah, how brave is that of her?
Paul Sanders stayed to keep hosing down the fire tower steps, letting Clarissy safely escape. Finally, on the 4th day, the arsonist was spotted from the tower as he attempted to light more fires in the woods. A car chase took place, with blockades up left and right, but the arsonist managed to escape. The fire was finally under control, and a few days later, it rained, quenching any remaining embers. In the end, the fire burned almost 2,500 acres of land. Finally, Clarissy, Clinton, and the others could relax. Clarissy continued her lookout responsibilities for 6 more years, walking down the steps one final time in 1970. The Georgia Tower was taken down 2 years later. In a picture of her from 1995, Clarissy stands in front of a piece of old farm equipment, her hands in the pockets of her overalls. She looks tough, tired, and like she won't take crap from anyone. She also looks like a woman who has had a life well lived, because it was. Female fire lookouts are evident over the past 100 years of Indiana and U.S. history, and women have also had their fingerprints on our state park system since its inception. So come with me on a quick rabbit trail, because while we're talking about women climbing up fire towers, we might as well spotlight a few other women who reached new heights. While state parks enthusiasts know the name Richard Lieber as the father of the Indiana park system, you may not know the name Juliet Strauss. She's known as the mother of Indiana state parks. She was a syndicated columnist, and in 1915, Strauss was an advocate for creating state parks. Here's Ginger Murphy, the DNR Deputy Director for Stewardship, who herself is a female icon in the state park system.
Probably the person who is most significant in our park system is Juliet Strauss, and she lived in Park County and grew up playing and spending time outdoors in what became Turkey Run State Park. In the early 1900s, we were about to celebrate Indiana's centennial. The legislature and the governor said, hey, we need to do something special for the centennial. And Lieber and Juliet Strauss basically said, why don't we create a state park system as a gift to Hoosiers? She was very instrumental in writing the governor and in writing other people and trying to make connections to purchase Turkey Run. She got Lieber to go over there and see the site and convinced him that that's where the first state park should be. Probably one of the most important women in our history.
While Turkey Run ended up becoming Indiana's second state park, Juliet Strauss was there at the beginning to create our parks. There's a statue of her at Turkey Run today to honor her contributions. Along with Juliet Strauss, Lucy Pitchler is who we have to thank for the interpretive naturalist position in our parks. I've done an entire episode about her impact. There's even an award in her name that recognizes park employees who provide exemplary interpretive services. Our state parks inns were also influenced by women. Ben Swenson was the manager at Potawatomi Inn at Pokagon from 1936 to 1948. While he handled the administrative side, it was his wife Helen who created the culture and coziness of the inn.
She was the lodge manager at Pokagon. She and her husband Ben were the lodge managers at the Potawatomi Inn for a number of years. And then she ran a camp on the other side of what's now the interstate. It was called Wing Haven. So she was an artist and a bird watcher, an outdoor lover.
Her artistic side and marketing instincts were used to promote events at the inn and park. The posters she created are really cool, the kind of vintage state park images people would still buy today. Her influence was so great, she is the one Swenson Lodge is named for at Trine State Recreation Area. Many women who shaped Indiana state parks stepped into positions along with their spouses. They had a natural aptitude for their role and proved that by filling in and stepping up when they saw a need. Ann Norton from Mound State Park was another one of those women. Angie Manuel is the interpretive naturalist manager for all the state parks, but she worked at Mounds in the past. She told me about Ann.
She was married to Mr. Norton, who was sort of the first superintendent, but he wasn't able to fulfill the role, and so she knew the ins and outs of how to run that property anyway, so she just assumed the position and raised her family on that property, took care of the park. It was a time when, women were not at the helm.
Ann held the role for 8 years, getting paid $100 a month. She was briefly replaced when another person was appointed to the job, but returned for another 4 years after that. Ann successfully balanced her job while caring for their 4 children and a husband with health problems. In the 1930s, I'm guessing this would have been rather shocking to many. Angie has even been able to talk with one of Ann's children.
Was very fortunate to get to meet her son. I did there. Charlie Norton was her son, and learned more about her time there. But he grew up in that park, so he has absolute memories of his mom running the park and serving fried chicken at the pavilion. And
I can't think of a better way to grow up as a kid than having free run of a state park. In addition to these, there are even more stories of men, women, and children who have positively shaped Indiana. There isn't time to explore all of their lives, but if you're interested in learning more about women in our state parks, don't overlook the contributions of author Jean Stratton Porter, who helped Pokagon enter the state parks family, or Dorothy Buell, who was part of the Prairie Club that helped establish the Indiana Dunes State Park. She created the Save the Dunes Council in 1952. That led to the formation of the National Park and the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore. And maybe like me, you'll be surprised to hear that Cecil M. Hardin Lake is named for a woman. Cecil Hardin was a 5-time U.S. representative, proudly serving her Indiana constituents in Congress. We'll learn more about her on an episode about Raccoon State Recreation Area. And there are a lot of women in leadership in state park systems today. a reality that would have seemed crazy to many when the parks began. But now it's such a natural move, it's almost ordinary, which is how it should be. Ginger Murphy, DNR's Deputy Director for Stewardship, is one of those women. She's loved the outdoors and working with kids since her very first job at a camp. She worked as an interpretive naturalist for 12 years. She then moved into a position as interpretive manager, overseeing all the naturalists in the state to ensure the history and science of the parks connects with visitors. And like the women I've mentioned already, it happened naturally, stepping up and doing the work without even realizing she was doing something that had never been done before. Were you the first woman to have been in that position?
Yes, I was. Yeah. Because both of the people who'd been at, yes, I was. There were two men in the position beforehand. So yeah, I didn't
you were
even thought about
groundbreaking even
that.
then.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that. I started working in parks, in Indiana State Parks in 1985. So I came into the system when there really were not very many women in leadership roles. There was an assistant manager where I worked at Salamone. So it's been fun to watch the growth in women in leadership roles in our state park system. There are times that I still sit in meetings where I'm the only woman, and I don't even think twice about it most of the time, because I'm here to do what I do and say what I need to say, and there's never been any issue with that. So I think we had people whose shoulders we stood on, but I think we are also opening the way for younger women who are now serving as managers and assistant managers to more easily move into those leadership roles when they're ready. So I think that's a part of what we're all trying to do.
Now as the Deputy Director for Stewardship, Ginger's involved with overseeing work in areas like volunteer coordination, resource management, cultural resources, landscape and trail design, and preserving historic buildings. Many of the initiatives, grants, and programs you enjoy are because of Ginger's behind-the-scenes work. But whether she's developing future female leaders or implementing a $50 million grant from Lilly Endowment, Ginger finds joy in what she does.
I love the work I do, and I've always felt called to service, to public service, and so this fits right in with that.
Mabel, Hallie, Clarissa and Tina, Juliet, Lucy, Helen, Anne, Angie, and Ginger. You may not have known their names before, but now you do. And what an incredible group of women who have shaped our parks. Okay, let's get back to fire towers. What's the status report on them these days? Well, in Indiana, we aren't using them actively, aside from emergency situations. But if you know someone interested in being a lookout, there are states who hire them during certain seasons.
None of them are active like on a daily basis, but even like when I was on the Forest Service, we just had the one tower left. But if it was a really bad night, or if we knew there were fires in the wilderness, because that's where our only tower is, somebody might run up and look around and see if we could see where the fire was. So they're used in that way, but not on a normal basis. But out east, I hike the Appalachian Trail. I've hiked pieces of it a lot. And so we would come, like in New Jersey, in bad fire danger, they man all their towers. So some states still man their towers, but it's usually with volunteers. It's not a regular thing. But out west, they hire people to man some of their towers.
What is the career path for somebody who's like standing on the top of something tall in the middle of the woods all alone? It sounds like the ideal job.
You have to have good vision, and I think they do have an aptitude test to make sure. They used to have, you'd stand in a football field, and you'd have to be able to distinguish things. There's something on the website that tells you the career path to do that.
Do you have to have a degree in forestry then, or things like that?
I don't
Not
think
necessarily.
so. No.
And even more exciting is that if you want to, you could actually buy an old fire tower and start timing yourself how quickly you can make it to the top.
It's not expensive to buy a tower. You can buy a lookout tower from anywhere from $1,000 to $3,000. So it's not that expensive to pay for the tower. Some of them actually sell for a few dollars. But then you have to get them taken down and moved and set up, put up again. There's another man, a landowner, who recently contacted me, and he said he wants to put a tower on his land. How could he buy a tower? So I sent him several that I know are for sale. And if you get our Lookout magazine, if you're a member of FFLA, they always have some in the back that people are trying to sell.
If somebody wants to buy a fire tower, or
just join our
whatever
agent, our organization, and that we wish they wouldn't keep selling them. The states would take care of them. But
so if anyone else wants to buy a fire tower, do I have a business proposition for you? Fire Tower Adventure Park. Don't steal my idea. I just need a little money. Whether you love climbing them or simply gazing up at them, Fire towers are amazing structures with a rich history, and in many places, a present need. Fire towers have often defined communities, developing a sense of place and purpose for those who live near them. Whether a teenage boy or an adult man or woman, fire towers offered people a chance to protect their home and their neighbors. Yet even when they were first put up, one of the things lookouts loved most about their towers was not the adrenaline rush of seeing smoke or how quickly they could climb the stairs, but it was something we appreciate about them today: the stillness and peace we find at the top. Clarissa Carroll found joy and serenity being a lookout. She said, "When you stand in the tower and survey the beautiful earth, you feel as if you were next to heaven." Next time you see a fire tower, be a little brave and climb it. But most of all, remember the lookouts and enjoy a little slice of heaven from up in the sky. A huge thanks goes to Ginger Murphy and Angie Manuel from DNR for sharing with me about women who contributed to the state parks. And an even bigger thank you to Tina Ligman for sharing your time and years of knowledge about fire towers with me. I'm also indebted to many historians, authors, and researchers for their work. If you want to learn more about fire towers, check out the articles and resources listed in the show notes. In the Parks is not officially associated with Indiana DNR, but I'm grateful for all the incredible work they do for our parks. Please share this podcast with your friends and give it a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow along on Instagram and Facebook at In the Parks Online. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you in the parks.